um, to support the event. So if you're interested in presenting on something related to evaluation capacity building, that's the focus of the conference, and the keynote will be Jean King, who is awesome. Yeah. Theorist practitioner, educator, rad lady. So those are the upcoming things. Kim, thank you so much for kicking off the year. This is our first event for 2017, and we're so pleased to have you. So yeah, Kim Leonard will be talking about crafting survey questions, and I don't want to take up too much of your time with the introduction, but I'll just say that she is a senior evaluation officer at the Oregon Community Foundation, where she manages evaluations of several large grant-making initiatives, each of which includes at least one survey-based data collection component. So she's worked on many surveys over the years and is currently collaborating on a book that will be a Sage publication coming out in the fall.
Hopefully.
Fingers crossed. I hold you to it.
That's what we've been saying.
Yeah, so anyways, Jenny, welcome.
Thanks all. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's really fun to talk about this stuff with a room full of people who also care about this stuff, which I appreciate. I expect I might be preaching to the choir a little bit throughout this, so take from this what you wish, and hopefully everyone will find at least something here that's useful, even if it's just a sort of reminder or refresher about how to do surveys well. So before we get started, I want to make sure everybody gets a copy of the little warm-up exercise quiz. So if you, Katie, don't mind helping make sure those get around the room. And just take a couple minutes, if you haven't already, to look over that quiz. And the idea is to spot the problem. So these are pretty terrible questions. So if you can identify where the problem is, and we'll take just a couple of quick minutes to do that while people get settled, and then we'll talk more about the problems that we see in a little bit. Sorry, I know that's asking to multitask if you're eating. So while you look at that, I'll just put a little plug in for Open too. I've been involved with Open for a long time now and have really appreciated the community. So if any of you are not members and are just sort of checking it out, really encourage you to sign up for membership, come to other events. The conference will be really awesome in the fall, so I'm excited about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Cool. So no need to have gotten all the way through that, but hopefully you spotted at least a couple of sort of glaring issues in some of the questions. Cool. So we'll come back to those in a few minutes. So I wanted to just start with an explanation of why I'm geeking out this much about surveys and about question design specifically. So it all started with a venting session on Twitter, basically. I was frustrated with looking at really crappy surveys and was venting, and Sheila Robinson and I started chatting via Twitter, and I didn't know her at the time. This was back in 2012, and it turned into sort of a fabulous, amazing friendship and collaboration effort. So she and I started blogging together, which turned into a book offer from Sage Publications. So we're now we're about 3/4 of the way done with a book that's really specifically about survey question design, and it talks a little bit about the full survey process, but it really hones in on question design. One of our great frustrations was that there's a lot of advice out there about what not to do. No double-barreled questions, for example, and not a lot of great guidance that's positive, like what to do. And a lot of the literature about how respondents process and answer questions is pretty old at this point. So we found a lot of opportunity, or we found that our opportunity was really in kind of refreshing that information and trying to share what we were learning through our work, as well as as we started to dig into the literature and writing this book, all the stuff that we were covering, old and new alike. So that's kind of how this all got started for me. And of course, we know if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get the right answers. So the more that we looked at the literature and the more that we thought about this, the more that we realized that the question crafting, the actual language of the questions and responses, is really the heart of the thing, right? There's all kinds of other things we can do wrong with surveys, but if we write poor questions, we're in trouble. So, so we started to really explore that and look, like I said, into the literature about what we could learn from things like cognitive science about how people look at questions and answer them. So I'm going to go super quickly through how we see the survey design process, what those basic steps are. And we are actually working with the book in infusing design thinking into those steps and kind of drawing connections between those two things, which is, I think, super exciting. I'm not going to get into that in depth today. We're going to talk about why question design matters. This is where I might be preaching to the choir a little bit, but that's okay. We're going to do a little workshopping of some problematic questions, including some of the ones from the quiz. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about demographic questions, because those are especially sticky, I think. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A at the end. And absolutely, totally welcome your ideas and thoughts and reactions as well, of course, because we're in the middle of writing the book. You may just have ideas for me too, so I appreciate that. So why survey design? Why do we even worry about this? Anyone can develop a survey now, right? That is exactly why we need to worry about it, because anyone can and anyone is. We see so many terrible surveys, and some of the questions on your quiz, as terrible as they seem, are actually not far from real-life examples, and I'll show you some really terrible real-life examples later that we've run into. So we, in our review of the lit, have found, or we've sort of summed up 7 major reasons for why survey design and really careful, thoughtful survey design matters. First, they're inherently imperfect. We have to recognize that up front. They can very easily be fraught with error for a lot of different reasons, including just not paying close enough attention to what you're writing. Self-reports. Most surveys are self-reports about attitudes or behavior or knowledge. They're problematic. They just are, right? We're not very good at being honest about ourselves or being reflective about ourselves. Surveys are often developed without enough study or practice. Everyone's doing this. So we as evaluators and researchers have to do it better than the average creature in order to get the kind of response that we want, right? The more bad surveys someone sees, the less likely they are to respond to one of ours. So we have an obligation, I think, to do it better. Surveys developed internally are especially increasingly common and require extra attention, right? So appropriate, all that good stuff. It's not easy to do. I don't have all the answers, but it's something we have to work at. And finally, I already mentioned this, but survey fatigue and non-response just keep doing this, right? People are not interested in answering a survey every time they do anything, but they're asked to all the time. So that means we have to be extra alert. Cool. So super quickly, the survey design process, as Sheila and I have kind of framed it, is relatively straightforward, but not linear, right? Most of the time when you develop a survey, you go through a standard process, but I would argue that it's very iterative. But we get into in the book, and that's where it really becomes iterative, right? Because in theory, you're pre-testing, and then you're going back to drafting, and you might pre-test again, depending on how much time and resources you have for that. Administration, data collection, of course, data analysis, of course, and reporting and dissemination of results. So our book really focuses on the first 3 there, though we touch on the last 3. Apparently I have a whole bunch of slides with animation. I didn't realize I did that. So when we talk about planning and pre-drafting, we talk about a bunch of different things. We talk about the importance of confirming that a survey is the right tool. You gotta start here. We cannot automatically assume, right, again preaching to the choir, that a survey is the best option. Often it isn't. And Sheila and I both run into all the time in consulting with other folks that this is where things go wrong. People start drafting a survey when they don't need a survey. They need a focus group or a small set of interviews or a lit review because the information already exists in the world, right? Establishing survey purpose, taking the time to write down what the survey purpose is so important, and we often skip it. Determining what is to be measured. So based on survey purpose, what are we actually trying to measure, right? Pretty straightforward process, but it's really easy to forget or skip steps. Spending time understanding the survey context. What is the political, cultural, organizational setting in which the survey is going to be taken, received, who's using the data? All that stuff is super, super critical. Identifying desired respondents and considering their ability and motivation. We'll talk a lot more about this because this is super, 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 super critical. Because if we don't understand the people that we're trying to collect information from, we're not going to be able to word a question in a way that makes sense to them, right? Plan for administration. I see people skip this too. They just send the thing out without thinking about how they're going to get responses back and what follow-up might look like. So those are our basic steps, which I hope are helpful. And then as we talk about question development, we talk about thinking about question types really carefully. We're not going to go into all the types, but most folks know the basics, and I'm certainly happy to share more resources if folks are interested. Drafting questions, not assuming that your first draft is it. Developing effective response categories. So we actually talk separately about writing the question and writing the response options. Obviously, they have a relationship to each other that's super important, but we actually kind of break down the differences a little bit. And then again, we come back to considering respondents. It's very respondent-centered kind of design process and practice in our minds. It's really important. So, why do we care about question design? I've already alluded to this a little bit, but I'm going to share a couple of examples that really illustrate how wording can go wrong or how it can be really important. So the first example I have is from a pretty recent, actually, article from 538 that talks about the Mars study. Is anyone familiar with this at all? No? Okay, cool.
I'm sorry, I just left.
The Mars.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, that's the title. Yeah. So the Mars study, the Milwaukee Area Renters Survey, was the first really, really rigorous, detailed look at eviction in a major city in the U.S. It actually involved interviewers going out and interviewing folks using a survey sort of protocol about evictions, and they learned some really important things. So they talked to about 1,100 Milwaukee area tenants between 2009 and 2011, and they asked a battery of questions about housing history. And what they learned is essentially that this question doesn't work. So have you ever been evicted? What could go wrong with that question? It seems like a reasonable question, right? What happens, what might you guess happened when they asked that question?
My roommate got evicted the night.
Yeah, right? It's a little bit complicated sometimes. Yeah, what else?
They left before they were officially evicted.
Left before they were officially evicted, so they might not see that as an eviction. Yeah.
Was it a no-cause eviction?
No cause evictions. Yeah, there's a lot of informal circumstances that come into play, right? So what they found was that a ton of people, essentially they were getting an underreport of evictions. A ton of people were not thinking of their situation as an eviction, even though it was, in the minds of the Mars study folks. So they essentially were getting a really incomplete picture. So they found that informal evictions were actually twice as common as the more formal ones in terms of how people kind of define that. So that happens without sort of the legal paper trail, and people didn't want to say, like, I was evicted. Like, there's also a little bit of a social desirability bias happening here, right? So they tried a number of things, including where do you live, which also didn't work. They found that to be really complicated. People had a hard time defining where they live in the same way as the study designers did. And they ended up really focusing on this last question, where do you spend most nights? And kind of going from there and actually building a history of housing for the respondents. Instead of starting from, have you been evicted, they actually started from, you know, where do you spend most nights and how'd you end up here and where were you before this, and much, much more involved process but essentially have demonstrated that a simple looking question wasn't getting them accurate information. What's really cool about this is, well, they asked more than 250 questions, which is crazy to think about. And obviously not going to work for a typical survey of something like this. But they learned so much about this that they've actually developed a protocol that's now going to be included in the American Community Survey and I think the HUD survey nationally. So a really cool example of how more in-depth work identified problems with a question that we never would have seen otherwise. And now we're going to hopefully have better data nationally about that problem. So kind of a cool example, I think. This is an oldie but a goodie. So this is from the 1940s. Was actually a study to identify whether people answered two different questions that were similar differently, right? Mm-hmm. This was actually a study about question wording. So here are the two questions they asked. Do you think the United States should forbid public speeches against democracy? And do you think the United States should allow public speeches against democracy? Clear difference, right? Can you guess what happened? How many yeses do you think they got to the first question proportionally? Percentage of yeses. Not very many? How many no's do you think they got for the second question? More or less? More? Yeah, you're right. So 54% of people said yes to the first question, and 75% of people said no to the second question. Their answers should have been the same, right? We should have seen the same proportion of people answering yes to the first and no to the second. So this tells us what about these questions? That one word made a huge difference in the way people answered. So we have to think ahead about how people are going to answer, how they're going to process the question, what the information is that we need, how to make it most clear for respondents so that they can answer as accurately as possible. Super interesting, right? I think the point is that there's no such thing as a neutral question, that they don't exist. And just like I think evaluators and researchers are getting better and better at recognizing that their work is not totally objective, the same thing has to happen for survey research work. Every question comes with our biases, our wording as researchers, and has perspective. So we have to recognize that. It's really important. So how hard can this be, really? We have had a lot of fun learning about the cognitive aspects of survey methodology work that happened in the 80s and the 90s. So essentially this was the first time that survey researchers got together with cognitive scientists and actually talked about what they knew. So that survey researchers could think about how people process questions and answer them. And the cognitive scientists, I think, learned quite a bit from the survey researchers about how research practice as well. So this little love story happened. And a wealth of literature has really come out since then. We have some favorites that I'll give you a handout later that have, the handout has a couple of resources from some of our favorites, and we'll talk through a little bit of that in a minute. Including especially around asking questions about behavior, because that's especially tricky. And the cognitive scientists like to talk about behavior. One of the things that happened, it's kind of a controlling idea that shifted because of this work, was that survey researchers went from thinking about the effects of survey error and focusing on sort of error mitigation to thinking about the causes of survey error and how they can prevent survey error in the first place. Seems really basic now, right? But this was a big deal many decades ago. They figured out that vagueness and ambiguity can lower response rates, for example. And so they began to focus a lot more attention on that cognitive side and thinking about how to prevent that. Tornjo, which is one of our favorite resources, describes this sort of movement or this collaborative effort as with one sentence: reporting errors in surveys arise from problems in the underlying cognitive processes through which respondents generate the answers to their survey questions. Right? Seems pretty straightforward, but for whatever reason, this is big light bulbs, right? And it's something that I think, unless you have spent a lot of time thinking about and working on survey design, doesn't necessarily occur to us as we're drafting questions. We think we know how to write a simple question with simple answers, but if you're not thinking about the cognitive processes and the language, then it's really tough to get it right. So they talk about, Turinjo talks about how the vehicle of survey is language. And understanding how people comprehend speech, written materials, language comprehension in general is really based on not just the written word, right, and like syntax and stuff we learned about in English class, but also about the way that we think and how we process meaning of words. So how evaluators ask a question can dramatically influence the answers they receive, right? Duh. Minor changes in wording, format, or order can profoundly affect results, and Schwartz and Oyserman is another like really stellar resource if you like to read textbooks about this stuff, like we do. So, really, how hard can this be? How complicated is it, or does it need to be? So I'm going to walk through some of Schwartz and Oyserman's work, which really broke down the process that a respondent goes through in answering questions specifically about behavior, but I think it applies to other kinds of questions as well. And I'm like buzzing through this, aren't I? Yeah. So first, they say a respondent has to understand the question. This is pretty fundamental. If you've written a question that your respondents aren't going to understand, you're in trouble, right? But we often make assumptions about what that means, what that looks like. Respondents have to identify the behavior of interest. So if we're asking them about a behavior, they have to understand what behavior we're asking them about. They have to be able to retrieve the relevant instances of the behavior from memory. How many glasses of wine have you had in the last week? Oh boy, a glass. What counts as a glass? Right? The last week. Well, they mean 7 days, business week. You have to be able to think that through, right? And I've already alluded to some of these others. Like correctly identify the relevant reference period. So when I say last week, what do I mean by last week? Search the period to retrieve relevant instances of the behavior. Well, I don't remember what I had for dinner on Wednesday. Did I have a glass of wine with dinner on Wednesday? Really think that through. Correctly date the recalled instances so that they can count them up. This is a lot of steps, right? Correctly add them up. Map this onto the response options. Oh boy, I had 7 glasses of wine this week. It was a rough week. But my options are 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 4 to 5. You know, mine's the highest option. Do I really want to write that down? Is this like I have to think about where my answer fits and whether I feel comfortable checking that box, right? And there's the last one. Candidly provide the answer for the researcher, right? We set people up for failure with that sometimes without thinking about it. So we would argue that, well, first of all, here's the kicker. Cognitive research shows that people can't do that. That's way too much stuff to do. People are terrible at this, especially when we're answering a survey online quickly, right? We're guessing a lot of the time, especially about behavior stuff like this. But I would argue that the process is the same whether you're being asked a question about behavior or about other things. There may be some nuances that are different. You might not have to be thinking about how many glasses of wine you had, a specific behavior, but you still have to go through cognitive processes that are similar when you think about your attitudes, your perspectives on something, which is another kind of thing we might ask about in surveys. So respondents first have to interpret the question. They have to identify what the question is asking. So looking for an attitude, a behavior, or what. They have to make a judgment about that thing. Apply it to their understanding. They have to figure out how to communicate their response. And they have to think about fit to your response options. And they are definitely thinking about editing their thoughts, right? Either because they need to or because we're compelled as human beings to think about how we respond to these things regardless, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So here's a little experiment for us. Turn to someone nearby, an elbow partner perhaps, and answer this question for each other. Take a couple minutes. What have you done today? You could actually. Thank you.
What have I done? I made coffee. I'm sure. And I turned around and came back home.
So no, it was like cutting off. It was doing the wrong resolution, which I don't get because it worked fine yesterday when I was testing it. I think I got it better by doing the presenter mode because it's actually just cutting off right there, like that. So
I remember which version I have of this live versus.
I don't think that's the issue. Like it should be able to mirror my screen. I just don't get why.
I'm glad it's functional.
I think so.
And make sure to switch if you haven't already. Oh, that is really okay. We'll just call it. That was really effective. So, even simple sounding questions pose really complicated cognitive tasks, right? We've established that. So, is someone willing to share what their partner answered? Carolyn.
Well, my partner said something very interesting because I even talked about, like I was having some cereal. She was like, "Oh, I wasn't even thinking before work."
Oh,
and so I was
right.
like, "Oh yeah, you're thinking about your work day, your whole day, the time you open your eyes."
That's that reference period piece, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else come up for anybody that was especially interesting that they want to share?
Well, it's kind of about the reference period, but I started thinking about something I did the day before, and then realized, no, that wasn't today, that was yesterday.
Because our brains get distracted really easily, right? That's totally great. Yeah, cool. The words here make sense, right? There's not a wording problem, but there's a specificity problem at the very least, right? In terms of asking this as a survey question, let alone an interview question. It's open-ended, so we'll talk about that a little bit, but I'm not going to get into it in too much detail. How many of you said you sent an email? How many of you actually sent an email today? Yeah, that's what I thought. How many of you sent a text to someone and mentioned it? How many of you sent a text to someone today and didn't mention it? Yeah, right? So you get where I'm going with this. There's so much stuff that can get left out if we're not specific about what the information is we're looking for. This doesn't tell me anything as a respondent about what the researcher wants to know. There's all kinds of ways you can do a better job of doing that. In the question wording itself, in instructions, in the response options, all that stuff, right? Cool. Let's look at some bad questions. So to pull out those quizzes, our little warm-up activity, and I might actually, Katie, do you mind throwing one my way? Multiple.
Yeah.
So, what's wrong with the first question?
3-for-1 sale.
3-for-1 sale. Not only is it double-barreled, it's triple-barreled. How might we fix this?
Break it apart into 3 separate questions if you really care about the timeliness, the relevance, and the appropriateness.
Right, maybe we only have one of those things and we just need to make up our minds, right? Yeah. What about the second one? What's wrong?
The question doesn't match the response options.
Yeah, that's great, yes.
challenging cognitively to like agree with a negative.
There's kind of a double negative there, right? Too. We should not eliminate. It's a little bit hidden, but it's there.
Right.
Erin, you said something about matching response options to the question. What would better response options look like, even with the double negative?
Well, we should not eliminate spending on this program. Something like, I agree we should eliminate spending. I would need more time to think.
Yeah,
about it.
that's,
Maybe
I put you on the spot.
it's maybe even the first question isn't how you feel. It's like how much you agree or disagree with the following
There
statement.
you go. So you can either tweak the question to match response options that read reasonably, or the other way around, depending on what your question is. And obviously this question needs help anyway, right? We wouldn't hopefully leave it this way. Yeah. I actually find myself telling people to avoid Likert scales more and more and more. That's what that is, right? Strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. Well, we're missing the neutral, but which might be a whole other issue. The neutral is missing. Do you need a neutral? Depends. But because it's much easier for people to comprehend matching responses, so if you're able to mirror the language in the question in the responses, it's much easier for people to answer correctly. You don't have to think about what agree means, right? And I think we'll see an example of that hopefully in a minute. What about three is sort of the same problem, right? 4. What about 4? What's going on there?
It's a new for once.
Yeah. There's 2 questions there, right? So again, you could break it up, or maybe you only need one answer. What's wrong with 9? Did anyone get that far?
There are 2 options for, say, you're 35.
We have overlapping response options. Embarrassingly, Sheila and I sent the first draft of our first 4 chapters out to reviewers with this problem in it. We were trying to illustrate not doing that, and we left a category. That's how easy it is to do this, right? It's super, super easy to make that mistake. What about 10? What could go wrong there? There's no other.
It's not clear if they should just pick one.
Yeah, that's true. Yep, agreed. Adding a simple check all that apply can save you so much heartache later. We did this, we surveyed some youth. It was the first round of the survey. I don't know if David remembers this, because he was working with us at the time. Students in middle school, we were asking them what their plans were after high school, which is like a whole other kind of problem, right? Because they don't know yet. But it was on paper, because a lot of them are rural, and we gave them a bunch of options, and we didn't specify check all and apply. So some people checked one, some people checked a bunch of them, and we had to figure out how to deal with analyzing that question as a result. We added some instructions the next year, which helped. Shari?
Oh, I didn't have any.
Okay. Really, really easy to do that. And that's where thinking about what your like trying to anticipate your respondents can be really, really helpful. So, okay, cool. Let's look at some other really terrible real life examples. So these are just a few of a collection Sheila and I have been gathering for the last couple of years. This is, I think, from a doctor's office. What is going on here? What could go wrong? Katie's making the face that I make when I look at this question, which is, what do they even mean?
Yeah, what does that even mean? I assumed it was like an airport study.
It's not clear enough, right? What if you had no delays? How do you answer that first question? And you have to pick something, right? Like, I don't know how they're going to use that. That data is garbage in, right? It's a garbage in question. So that's one. How might we fix this? If you actually do want to know if someone experienced delays and whether they were informed about them, which, whatever.
Make it a yes or no. Were you in? If it was there a delay, yes or no?
Yep.
Yeah.
Were you informed?
When were you informed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, like, does the degree to which you were informed, like, what?
That
Yeah.
makes no sense. They're
Yeah.
trying to put a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah. We see this stuff all the time. And I know that folks in the room are not doing this kind of stuff, but because people are seeing this all the time, this is what they're frustrated by. And if they run into one bad question in your survey, they're like, I'm out here, get it. Because this is the crap that they see all the time. So that's why I think we're obligated to do way better than that. I think this is from the same survey, actually, Scarolita. This one's kind of small, so I'll read it. The questions in the survey will refer to the provider named in question 1 as this provider. Please think of the person as you answer the survey. Is this the provider you usually see if you need a checkup, want advice about a problem, or get sick or hurt?
That should be like choices that they check off rather than a yes or a no.
Yeah, there's way too much going on
That
there.
should be check out that applied, check out
Yeah.
one advice.
Yeah, and here's what Sheila was thinking when she got the survey. That's not my provider. Like, I haven't even been seeing that person. I saw them once, but they're, like, not my usual doctor. So how do I answer that second question? Less than 6 months, but that's not useful. She's worrying about what's going to be useful for the folks getting the survey back, which is kind of her. Sort of a similar problem, right? What do you see here? The order is confusing. What else?
Also the once a year or less, and then it goes into the rest of the year, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think these are overlapping options, right? Even just saying pick the one that best fits would have helped, right? Because then you're giving the respondent a clue about what information that you want. But we could probably all write way better options than that. Yeah, this is a real survey. Right, so where would you put twice a week? Where would you put 3 to 4 times a week? Like, mystery to me. Sorry, these are really small. Please indicate how useful the following content will be to your work going forward.
That should be mirrored.
Yeah, bingo. If you leave with no other advice from me, mirror your response options to your survey wording. The use of student surveys in the context of the STLE grant, doesn't matter that we don't know what that is. How useful will that be? Strongly agree, disagree, and strongly agree? Those don't work. Someone's applying a Likert scale to something that should not be a Likert scale. They're probably trying to collapse multiple questions together and make the survey look shorter, right? Yeah.
Make it work in Survey Monkey.
Yeah. The question does not match the responses. That one. And that one. How much time did it take to you? Oh, this is local actually, but I will not give away who it is. How much time did it take you to complete and submit all required application materials? This is a government organization, if that helps. What are the problems here?
Under 30 minutes and under an hour.
We've got an overlapping categories problem again. What other problem might we have? Has anyone applied for a government position? How often are you in any other category other than this one? Right? Like, who's written supplemental question answers before? It takes forever. So my guess is that they got a whole bunch of answers here and no useful information out of this question because it doesn't really tell them how long it took people to do it. Right? That was the only problematic question on the survey they shared with me, which is pretty good. So, other examples, confessions. They don't have a really good story for us. That's something they did wrong. I can share more, but
I was working at a local nonprofit as an intern, and we were designing a survey for school districts across the country to find out their early childhood, if they had early childhood in their schools. And we totally put an option for teacher education that was like not even a real thing. Like, it totally did not apply, and I didn't know what it was, so I couldn't catch it because I was just designing the survey, and the person that was telling me, you know, oh, these things, just put it in there off the top of her head, and it went through like 4 different people to check it, and nobody caught it. And then we started getting a response back, and we're like, wait, what is this thing, and why are people marking it, but it's not? So it was just very kind of like, whoops, there goes that question.
Yeah. So the people that you shared it with, were they potential respondents, or were they just people working
No,
on the
there were
project
people
with
in
you?
the organization.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, we didn't pilot it with anybody who would have actually been.
Yeah. Which is hard to do in real life, right? To actually pilot stuff like that. But it can be done pretty informally. Like, you might have only had to show it to 2 people
Yeah.
who are actually like your desired respondents to identify that problem.
Yep.
Yeah, totally. That's great. Other examples or confessions?
Something kind of related to that fixed it by just doing 2 cognitive interviews. We designed a survey for students going for interns, underrepresented youth, high school students doing an internship at the zoo. And we were so like in the details of the survey that I didn't realize one of the questions was if they've been involved in any internships. And it didn't occur to me that they would be confused if we were referring to the internship that they were in and we were evaluating.
Yeah.
So we did.
Or other internships in general?
Yeah, so I did a cognitive interview with 2 of the students who were towards the end of the internship that weren't involved in the evaluation, and they brought it up. They were like, I'm confused by this. Do you mean the zoo internship or a different one? So yeah, so just doing like 1 or 2 pilots helps.
It takes time, but it's so worth it because you would have had probably unuseful information as a result of that question if you hadn't done that, right? Are folks familiar with cognitive interviewing? I don't think it's done very often because it's kind of labor intensive. Do you mind sharing a little bit about what that process looked like for you guys?
Sure, we did a really fast version. So conveniently we had a group of interns at the end of the internship that we could kind of grab. But I basically sat down with them, kind of explained it in the context of the survey and who was actually going to take it. And then they sat down and went through and took it. I didn't have them, there's different ways to do cognitive interviewing. So one of the ways is that you can have them think out loud while you take the survey. I didn't do that, I just let them take it. And then afterwards I had a list of questions that I asked them about like, how relevant were the questions? Were any questions confusing? Did the order make sense of the questions, like how they were grouped? So I had a list of questions that I asked them, and then they offered, just random feedback too. So yeah, it was really helpful.
And you did it individually with each person?
I did it individually just with 2, yeah.
But you got hugely useful information on that,
Yeah, we ended
right?
up tweaking 3 or 4 items based on these.
That's great.
interviews.
Totally worth doing. I've not had the opportunity to do like a full-blown cognitive interview process, which I think is kind of intense. Often survey research labs will do that kind of work. I don't know if the PSC one does or not, but
I don't know either.
Yeah.
No.
I don't think it happens. No, the answer is no. Okay.
We'll do live pilot testing, but
Okay.
with like 50 respondents
Okay.
and just take our interviewers' feedback usually
Okay.
of how the survey went.
Cool.
Yeah, but we'll do a pretty large pilot if we have the budget for it.
That's awesome. Yeah, hugely helpful,
Yeah,
right?
but not ever discussing it with the respondent and having that type of conversation. Then we've never tried it.
Using those strategies like the Think Aloud strategy can also help, even if you can't do that with desired respondents, if you're doing it with like your internal team or you have a peer that you can share the survey with, to kind of walk through the mental process, like talk to me about what you're seeing in the question and why you're responding the way you're responding. Sometimes can surface stuff that you didn't anticipate because you're too close to the work, right? Like that happens to me all the time. I'm like, I don't know if this makes sense anymore because I think it does, but I'm way too close. So those are some of examples of kind of what we call pre-testing, right? Piloting, cognitive interviewing, informal processes that are similar. I've definitely seen people do something like cognitive interviewing in a group setting too, which has pros and cons. People might influence each other's sort of responses, but can be more efficient if you happen to be able to get a convenient group of people together. You have a meeting that's already happening, and you can share a survey with folks. So clearly my advice is to encourage you to think about trying to build that in, which requires planning, right, ahead of time in order to make it happen, usually on the timeline that you have and with the resources that you have. Cool. One more example. This is from some work that Sheila did she does a lot of PD for teachers. She's in upstate New York and works for a school district there. So she used to ask the question of folks after her PD workshops, what did you learn? Seems pretty straightforward. And what she usually got back was, whoops, cheat. What she usually got back was miming what the title of the workshop was. People would say, if the workshop was about survey question design, they're like, I learned about survey question design. She's like, that's super helpful, right? It doesn't tell her anything about what they got out of the workshop. So she played with a different option and found it really successful. So instead she asked, how do you feel? Gave them some options. And then said, why? Why did you pick what you picked? And people were suddenly prompted to think about what this workshop sort of did for them mentally, and then why that was the case. And she found this way more useful. So instead of I learned about survey design, she would get things like, I have a better understanding of how the classroom teacher teaches. I'm inspired to implement Greek Latin roots in daily instruction, right? She's getting way more rich information from what is still an open-ended question in a survey, which, proceed with caution, but way more helpful information than she was by asking what seemed like the far more straightforward question. This is a good example of where, right, the first question she asked, how did you feel? She doesn't actually care. It's a prompt to get people thinking so that they'll explain why they felt that way, right? She cares if people were bored, obviously, but that's not the point, right? The point is to get that richer information out of people. Yeah. Kind of cool, huh? Demographic questions. How are we doing? Good. So I don't have any easy answers for these. What have people found successful in dealing with adding demographic questions to surveys? Any tips and tricks?
It's kind of a double-edged sword that we're confined by National Institutes of Health, their definition of demographics, which is bad sometimes, and you have to put people in boxes just to get this information to get funded.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that's the problem you have, and you don't have to think out of it because you cannot do anything else besides those.
Sometimes we're totally pinned by whatever we're trying to map our survey data to, right? That definitely has happened with us. I would love to be asking a race and ethnicity question differently on a particular survey I have than I am, but I have to map it to ODE data, and so I'm using that, I have to use ODE categories, the Department of Ed.
And I think one of the most common things I've seen when I start working with someone and they have the demographic on the race or the ethnic is that they always put choose one. I'm like, no. They can choose more than one.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. This is the way that the county, Multnomah County, is trying to ask race and ethnicity, and this is based on some work that the Coalition of Communities of Color has done. And it is very much a check all that apply situation, right? Way harder to deal with the analysis of this question. Way more considerations about whether you might accidentally identify who someone is because you've only got one person who's three of those things in your population, but this is way more accurate, appropriate, relevant for people. Feels a lot less uncomfortable than checking an other box, which we like to avoid. So this is sort of my favorite thing to recommend, but it's not always easy to actually do. Sometimes we're confined by other things. But if we can all work on pushing this, then maybe we'll fix some of those problems.
I see that this question is number 24.
Yeah.
Have you guys encountered issues of where to put demographics questions?
Yeah, that's also hard.
Because in our surveys that we do, we try to put them at the end because if they confront that at the beginning, they might not complete the survey.
Yeah, that's hard, and it kind of depends on the context sometimes. But because sometimes you're using these as a filter, maybe for other questions, and so then at the end, the very end doesn't work. But you can put them at the end, I think the end is the best. People are bored. This is a boring question to answer too. Like, make your first couple of questions interesting to answer. Get people sucked into the survey. Deal with all the other stuff at the end if you can. Yeah, that's what I try to do. Yeah. The other piece of advice I have is, do you really need this or not? please don't just include it because you think you should. Like, you might not need that information. If you don't have a plan to use this information, you don't have enough respondents responding so that you can use this, like, just don't bother. And that comes with huge pros and cons, right? I mean, we want to be able to talk about the results of our programs by group often, but it's not always the case that we can actually do that. So I would argue only gather what you need and can use. Do you guys know about the gender red person? I just learned about this year. This is version 3.2. There's probably already a 3.3 on the internet. It's pronounced metrosexual.com has a bigger, more detailed version of this poster that explains what it has, like a key, which is great. This is, I think, where we should be heading in terms of measuring gender identity. None of our survey tools can do this, right? There isn't an existing tool that can, other than paper, where you could ask someone to identify where they are on a spectrum, on a scale, right? But I think it's up to us to try to work towards that. And I think the point that this makes that's really important, or that I'm trying to make with this, is that this is ever changing and evolving. So we can't always assume that we think we know what the categories are right now and how best to ask this. We have to go to our respondents and make sure that the way that we're asking this question makes sense to them. Middle schoolers in Eastern Oregon might answer this question really differently than middle schoolers in Portland, just because of what they're exposed to or not. This question, many questions potentially, right? There's some great resources on that website about this and how people are thinking about gender identity and orientation and stuff right now, which I think is really useful. Sometimes the best approach is, well, I think pretty much always the best approach is to ask a question in a way that's going to be relevant and appropriate for your audience, for your respondents, and to put on the back burner any analysis concerns that you might have, right? It's usually not the best approach to think about, well, I need it to be really easy to analyze, so we're going to use like 2 categories and then other, and that's all I can handle, right? That's not, it's not going to feel good for a respondent, and especially if this isn't at the end of your survey, you're going to lose people or offend them. Yeah. Has anyone tried anything other than sort of the usual? I mean, has anyone seen anything with a scale on it, or, yeah?
Well, we just had like male, female, gender non-conforming.
Yeah. That's what I see most often, is sort of not an other category, right? You don't use the word other, obviously, but more categories than male, female at the very least. Yeah. Yeah. Not easy.
Yeah, we did how do you identify male, female, transgender, and it was hard because on the analytic end, we were weighting the data with census data, which is just male, female, but we decided
it was worth including.
It was worth it, yeah.
We did something similar with a survey, and what we had to contend with at the end was how to share that data, because we only had a couple of respondents who identified as transgender. We had to think really carefully about what we sort of suppressed in the sharing the responses back, so that we didn't identify a kid who didn't want to be identified but had answered the survey, accurately, or as accurately as they could. Yeah. Other demographic tips, conundrums. This is like as hard as it gets, I think. And again, I would just say, don't ask it if you don't need it.
I was recently encouraged to add a question about ability status, which I had not done before. And it's on a project that will be coming down the pike in the future, so I haven't actually implemented it, but I appreciated the recommendation. I think it's something that we should be increasingly thinking about.
And probably your best bet is going to be to talk to people in the community about how best to write that question, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I could remember the sort of options that were recommended to me. I haven't looked at it in a few months, but I was sort of like, my mind was blown to even consider putting that on the survey in the first place.
Yeah, it's loaded.
Yeah.
Or has potential to be.
Yeah.
In the way that we talk about it. Yeah, cool. I think I've already said all these things, but my bottom line advice is to ask for only what you need and have a clear plan for use. That goes not just for demographic data, but like, let's make all of our surveys shorter than they are. They probably don't need to be as long as they are. Almost always can make things shorter and more concise. We haven't talked about confidentiality and anonymity. Those are two different things, right? People know that? Because I see people confuse it all the time out there in the world. They say your response is going to be anonymous, and I can tell that they have enough information that this is not anonymous. They can tell who I am. Yeah, we have to promise the right thing to people and be clear about it. We've talked about pre-testing. I'm consulting desired respondents about language every time. And I think the gender question is the one that I keep in the back of my mind as a reminder of that, because it is so ever-changing. The Pride Foundation came to speak at my organization about this, and even they like constantly struggle with how to ask questions about that stuff. And their focus as an organization, right, is on that topic. So they find themselves having to check with the community constantly to make sure they're using the right language. Yeah. And then if you're consulting desired respondents anyway, talking about how best to use information can be really important, right? There may be things that you haven't thought about how you're going to use that information, like we don't want to out this transgender kid, but they may have other use considerations that might not be as obvious to you. So my best example of that, which is, I can't get into enough detail to be probably, this might be a little vague, but is a student survey that we were working on to measure social emotional learning. And there was a scale in the tool that we were adapting that included some questions about self-management and the behavior stuff. And historically in the community, that data had been kind of misused to blame students for their own success or lack thereof. And so we had to really think hard about whether, well, if we're going to have concerns about how this information is used, what does that mean? We ended up actually not including it because we didn't want the data to even be available for misuse in the end. So something we would not have known was an issue without talking to the community about use. Cool. So we have a few minutes left. Oh, we don't. How did that happen? Sorry, everybody. Let me pass this around. This is a draft of what I've been calling a mini guide, for kind of lack of a better description, that breaks down a lot of the process stuff we've talked about, kind of that planning and pre-drafting stage, and has the beginning of a checklist for writing questions that we're developing as part of the book. That is, I hope, a little bit more positively. It's less do not do this and more do this. This group probably has great feedback for me on what's in here, so please don't hesitate to email us with thoughts about things that are missing or don't make sense, or just happy to have your input and feedback. Sorry, I totally blabbed too long into the questions, but I hope it was helpful.
Thank you, David, too, for broadcasting this. And
Sort of.
And for those of you who did not hear this plug before, but if you're interested in a little bit more information about Open, we have these handy dandy cards here that just provide some background on the organization, their membership, and the membership.